The candles in the long library at Brindlemere Court had been lit 3 hours too early, and Verity Lown knew exactly why. A man who wishes to be obeyed in a hurry chooses bad light. He chooses the end of the day, when an old mind is tired, when the eye cannot read the small lines at the foot of a page, when the hand that holds the pen is glad of any reason to be done. So the candles burned, and the great deed lay open on the green leather, and the Duke of Brindlemere sat over it with the pen already wet in his fingers. She stood against the bookshelves where a companion was meant to stand, near enough to fetch, and far enough to be forgotten, and she watched the ink gather at the nib in a single black bead that wanted only to fall one stroke. One stroke, and the estate that had carried the family for 200 years would pass by his own free signature into the keeping of people who had never loved a foot of it. The footman by the door did not move. He had carried in the wine and set it down and stepped back to the wall as a footman should, and his face held nothing, and his livery was plain blue, and his gloves were white, and to every soul in that room he was furniture that walked. Verity alone had seen the thing the rest had missed. She had seen his eyes go to the deed, and stop there, and stay. The old Duke dipped the pen again, though it did not need it. His hand came down toward the paper. And the footman said 3 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not step from the wall. He said them the way a man says a thing he has decided to be ruined for, low and level and entirely without hope of reward. And they crossed the quiet room and laid one cold finger on the back of the Duke's hand. Do not sign. For one breath, nobody in the library breathed at all. The pen hung. The bead of ink fell at last, and made a small black star on the deed, an inch from the line where his name was meant to go, and the Duke of Brindlemere lifted his head and stared at the servant who had spoken, and Lady Augusta Vane, who had arranged the candles and the hour, and the tired old hand, turned slowly from the window with her smile already gone. I want you to hold that room in your mind, because everything that brought 4 people to that table took the better part of a winter, and a great deal of it turned on a woman the house had decided was nobody at all. Now let me take you back to the morning it began. The morning it began, Verity Lown had been at Brindlemere Court 11 weeks, and the house had already settled on what she was. She was the gentry girl whose father had gambled the living away and died of it, leaving a daughter with good manners and no money, which in that county was a kind of crime that no one names aloud but everyone punishes. She had come to be companion to the Duke, who was her father's distant kinsman, and the wage of a companion is a roof and 3 meals, and the steady understanding that you are a charity, to be spoken of in the 3rd person, while you stand in the room. To the household she was just the cousin who had come down in the world. Lady Augusta had said it on the first afternoon in the small drawing-room, in a voice pitched to carry. The girl has come down in the world, she had said to her son, as one might note that a chair had come down from the attic, and Verity had poured the tea and said nothing, and felt the words settle on her shoulders like dust. She was 24 years old. She had a steady carriage and a plain gray gown and dark auburn hair she pinned herself, and the thing the house did not know about her was that she had been raised, before the ruin, by a father who taught her to read a column of figures the way other girls were taught to read music. She could find the lie in an account book. She did not yet know that this small, unfashionable skill would matter to anyone. The Duke was failing. Verity saw it before the doctors named it, in the way his hand shook over the soup, and his memory slipped its moorings by candlelight, sharp in the morning and wandering by night. He was a kind man worn thin, the last of his line with no son and no nearer heir than a tangle of cousins and a deed of entail 2 centuries old that bound the estate to the blood. He spoke of his dead wife as though she were in the next room. He called Verity by her mother's name twice and apologized both times with a courtesy that broke her heart. Into this failing house, Lady Augusta Vane had moved like weather. She was the widow of the Duke's younger brother, and she had a son, Crispin, and she had a clear, cold understanding that the entail stood between that son and a dukedom. She was 60 years old and upright as a cathedral, and she ran the household now in all but name, and she was not a stupid woman or a lazy one. She had a plan, and she had been working it for a year, before Verity ever arrived, and she had no intention of leaving anything to chance. That was the first thing Verity learned about the new order at Brindlemere, and the lesson came from the footman. His name below stairs was Hart. He had been taken on in the autumn, a tall, quiet man of perhaps 32, with a still face and gray eyes and a way of holding himself that the other servants found cold. He did his work without complaint, and he spoke when spoken to, and he kept to himself in a manner that the housekeeper called proud, and the boot-boy called dull. And Verity, who had been raised to read a room before she read a book, found him neither. She found him watchful. He watched the family the way a man watches deep water, knowing how it kills. She first spoke to him over a dropped letter. She had let a folded paper fall on the cold stair to the morning room, and he had picked it up and returned it. And as he placed it in her hand, she saw his eyes go to the seal, and then to her face, and she understood that he had read the direction in the half-second he held it, and understood it, and filed it away. A footman is not supposed to read. She said nothing. He said, his voice low, only that the stair was cold, and she should mind her step, and went on. She watched him after that. She saw how he stood at the wall during dinner with his gaze on the documents Lady Augusta brought to the table under the cloth of family business. She saw him linger in the muniment room with a coal scuttle he did not need to fill. She saw, one gray afternoon, his hand close for an instant on a ledger left open on the steward's desk, and the small, precise way he turned the page to read what was beneath, the way of a man who knew what a contract looked like, and was hunting for one. What she did not yet know was that the footman called Hart had a different name in the world above stairs, and that he had come to Brindlemere not to serve, but to find a single sheet of paper, and that he had nearly given up. The pressure on the old Duke began in earnest with the lawyer. Mystery. Quill came down from town 3 times that winter, a soft round man with soft round hands, and a habit of agreeing with whoever had last spoken, and each time he came he brought papers, and each time the papers were a little thicker. Lady Augusta sat with him in the study, with the door closed. Verity, fetching the Duke's shawl, heard a fragment through the panel, the words deed of conveyance, and the words sound of mind, and Lady Augusta's voice, smooth as poured cream, saying that the Duke's wishes must of course be honored while he was still able to express them. Merde. The phrase, still able to express them, stayed with Verity all that night. She understood the shape of it then, or thought she did. A deed of conveyance. Not a will, which a court could question after a man was dead, but a living gift, signed by a living hand, transferring the estate now, while the Duke could be persuaded that the entail had been broken, and the property was his to give, and he would give it to Crispin Vane, because Lady Augusta would tell him that this was his own long-considered wish, and by the time he wandered back to himself in the morning, the thing would be done, and witnessed, and beyond recall. The entail was the wall, in her way, and Lady Augusta's whole campaign was the slow demolition of that wall. The deed of entail was a single ancient instrument, drawn in the reign of a long-dead king, and it lived by custom in a locked iron box in the muniment room, and it had not been looked at in living memory because no one had ever needed to. Whoever held that deed held the proof that the estate could not lawfully be given away. And the deed, when Verity finally thought to wonder where it was gone. She found that out by accident, on an errand for the Duke, who in a lucid hour had asked her to bring him the family settlement so that he might read his father's hand again. She went to the muniment room and found the iron box and found it empty of the one paper that mattered, and she stood with the cold lid in her hands and felt the floor of the house tilt under her. She was not alone in the room. The footman was there with his useless coal scuttle, and he had seen her face. He said, his voice level, that she would not find it there. He said that it had not been there since Michaelmas. And when she turned on him with the lid still in her hands and asked how a footman came to know what was in a Duke's iron box, he was silent for a long moment, and then he set the scuttle down and told her the truth, or the first piece of it. His name was Daniel Frost, He was no footman. He was the son of the man who by the old entail stood next in the true line after the Duke, a cousin's branch that Lady Augusta's husband had quarreled out of the family 30 years before over a disputed inheritance, papers misfiled, a claim left to rot. Daniel's father had died, believing himself cheated and unable to prove it. Daniel had come to Brindlemere in livery because livery is invisible, and a man who is invisible can stand in the room while the powerful speak. And he had come to find the entail deed and prove that the estate was bound to the blood and could not be conveyed away to Crispin Vane. He had been searching since autumn, and someone had reached the deed before him. Verity should have been afraid of him. A strange man, in a false name, with a claim of his own to the very estate, telling her a story no court would believe from a servant. She found instead that she believed him entirely, and the believing frightened her more than the man did, because it meant she was now inside the thing, and there is no companion's wage that pays for that. To the boot boy and the housekeeper, he was still just the cold, quiet footman who kept to himself. The label had not changed below stairs, even as the man behind it walked into the center of her life. That was the second time the house's verdict on a person was voiced aloud in front of her, and proved wrong, and she began to mistrust every verdict the house had ever handed down, including its verdict on herself. They became, that winter, two servants, a house full of servants, conspiring in plain sight. It was a courtship conducted entirely in the language of work. He would carry a scuttle to a room she happened to be dusting, and they would speak in low, quick sentences over the coal. She would copy a figure from Mr. Sexpin, Quill's papers when Lady Augusta left them on the table, and slipped the copy into Daniel's glove with the cleared plates. He commanded her in the short level way of a man who has decided to keep someone safe, to go nowhere alone with Crispin Vane, to be seen to know nothing, to keep her hands steady when the family spoke cruelty in front of her, as if she were a clock. She read the commands as coldness. At first, she learned to read them as what they were, and she learned the shape of his grief, which was the thing she had seen in him and not understood. His father had died waiting for a justice that never came, in a small, cold house, with the family papers spread on the table, certain to the last that the truth was written down somewhere and that no one would ever trouble to read it. Daniel had watched a good man break against a wall of indifference. He had come to Brindlemere not for the dukedom, he told her once, his face still as stone over a quiet feeling, but to make the indifference end. To find the paper his father had gone to the grave swearing existed, to read it aloud in a room where it could not be ignored. He said this with his eyes on the fire and his hands quiet, and Verity understood that the man the house thought cold had simply spent his whole life being unheard, and had stopped expecting to be heard, and that this was a different thing from coldness, and a sadder one. She found the deed in February, not the original, which was gone, burned for all anyone could prove, but its ghost. Lady Augusta was clever, but she had made the single mistake of the clever, which is to keep a record. In the account book that Verity could read like music, among the household figures, there was a payment in October to Mr. Blank's. Quill marked only as for services, and beside it, in Lady Augusta's own small hand, a private note she had never imagined a companion would parse, 4 words concerning the removal of the entail instrument, and then 2 words more, copy retained. Copy retained. Lady Augusta, who trusted no one, had not destroyed the deed at all. She had taken the original and locked it away and kept the proof of its own existence in her own ledger, because a woman who means to forge must first know exactly what she is forging. Verity carried that line to Daniel in the cold scullery passage at dusk, and for the first time since she had known him she saw his composure break, just at the edges, just for a moment, the way ice over a river will shift, without quite cracking. The original existed. It was somewhere in the house. And the woman who had hidden it had written down, in her own hand, that she had it. If you have stayed with me this far, hold your breath through what comes next, because this is the part of the winter, when everything they had built nearly came apart in a single afternoon. They were not the only ones reading a room. Lady Augusta Vane had not climbed where she had climbed. By missing things, she had noticed the companion. She had noticed the footman. She had noticed, in the way a spider notices a change in its web, that the two of them were never in a room together and yet were always somehow accounted for in the same part of the house. And she moved against the weaker of them first, because that is how such people work. She moved against the cousin who had come down in the world. It happened in the great drawing-room, with the Duke present and lucid and the whole upper household assembled for the reading of certain family arrangements, which was the velvet name Lady Augusta gave to her demolition. She had Mr. Will there with his soft hands and his papers. She had Crispin lounging by the fire. And in front of all of them, in a voice pitched to Carrie, she announced that an item of value had gone missing from the muniment room, and that suspicion, regrettably, fell upon the newest dependent of the house, the cousin whose father, as everyone knew, had been a man who took what was not his. The girl is her father's daughter, Lady Augusta said, and the room went very still. It was beautifully done. It was an accusation that explained everything at one stroke. If Verity was a thief, then anything she might later say about deeds or ledgers was the desperate slander of a cornered servant. If Verity was a thief, then her dismissal was not cruelty, but prudence, and she could be put out of the house and away from the papers before she finished reading them. Crispin smiled into the fire. Mr. Quill examined his soft hands. And the old Duke, who in his clear hours was still a gentleman, looked at the gray-gowned girl who poured his tea, and said in real distress that he could not believe it of her, and looked to his sister-in-law to be told what he must believe. Pay? Verity stood in the center of the carpet with every eye on her and understood that she could not win this. To deny it was to argue with a duchess in front of a duke. To produce the ledger now, half proven, was to spend her one shot in the dark and be called a forger in turn. She had a single advantage, and it was the only one she had ever had in that house. And it was simply that she did not need to be believed. She needed only to survive the afternoon with the ledger still hidden and her place not yet lost. So she did the thing her father had taught her, which was to keep her hands steady and her voice level, and to say less than the room expected. She said that she had taken nothing. She said that the muniment room was open to the steward and the family and the lawyer, and that she had been in it once, to fetch a settlement at his Grace's own request, and that she would be glad for her hands and her boxes to be searched. She said it without heat. The lack of heat was itself a kind of evidence, and the Duke heard it, and hesitated. The footman stood at the wall through all of it and did not move, and his face held nothing, and only Verity, glancing once toward the blue livery by the door, saw what it cost him to stand still, while the woman he had decided to keep safe was named a thief in front of the household. His hand was flat against the wall behind him. His jaw was carved stone. He did not speak, because to speak then was to ruin everything for nothing, and he knew it, and he held. They searched her room. They found nothing, because the ledger was not in her room. The ledger was where she had copied it single line and returned it, on Lady Augusta's own shelf, hidden in the place no one searches, which is the place a thing belongs. The search came up empty, and the accusation, lacking its proof, could not quite close its hand. Still, it had done its work. The house now half believed the cousin was a thief, and Lady Augusta, having failed to put her out, had at least made certain that nothing the girl ever said again would be heard clean. The girl is her father's daughter. The boot-boy repeated it in the kitchen that night, the way servants repeat a verdict, and it reached Verity through a third mouth, worn smooth as a coin, and she understood that the label had been set hard now, voiced and witnessed, and passed along, and that she would carry it for as long as she stayed in that house. That was the false defeat, and it nearly worked, and the thing that saved them was not luck. It was that Lady Augusta, in winning the afternoon, had been forced to show her hand. She had revealed that she knew something was missing. She had revealed that she feared the cousin enough to ruin her. And a woman who shows you what she fears has told you where her treasure is buried. Daniel understood it before Verity did. He found her in the cold passage that night, where the courtship of 2 servants was always conducted, and he did not comfort her because comfort was not the command the moment needed. He told her to think. He told her that Lady Augusta had not searched the muniment room, the obvious place, the place she controlled because Lady Augusta already knew the deed was not there. She had searched the cousin's room, which meant she believed the danger lay in what the cousin had read, not in what the cousin might find, which meant the original deed was not hidden against discovery any longer. It was hidden against use. It was kept somewhere close, somewhere she could reach it, because a forger who has burned her source can never be sure she will not need to check it again. Copy retained. She had not burned it, she had kept it. And she kept it where she kept the thing she valued most in the world, which was not gold and not jewels, but the proof of her son's coming greatness, and there was only one place in that house that Lady Augusta Vane locked against her own servants, and it was the small writing cabinet in her own dressing room, to which she alone held the key. They had 3 weeks. Mr. Quill had named the day. On the 1st of March, the Duke would sign the deed of conveyance, in the evening by candlelight, with the family as witnesses, and the estate would pass to Crispin Vane, and the true deed of entail, the only thing that could stop it, would stay locked in a cabinet 6 rooms away while it happened. Lady Augusta had thought of everything. She had thought of the lawyer and the candles and the tired old hand and the discredited cousin and the silent footman. She had thought of everything except that the 2 people she had counted as furniture had counted her right back. Verity got the key by being the thing the house had named her. A companion is a charity, spoken of in the 3rd person, present at every intimacy, and counted at none. She helped Lady Augusta dress. She held the pins. She was in the dressing room every evening of those 3 weeks, invisible and useful, and on the last evening, when Lady Augusta laid her ring of keys on the table to take down her hair, Verity, whose hands her father had trained to be steady, pressed the smallest key into a flat cake of wax she had warmed against her own body all that day, and laid the ring back exactly as it had been, and curtsied, and went out, and did not breathe until she reached the cold passage where Daniel waited. What the wax gave them, a quiet locksmith in the village turned to iron in 2 days, for a sum Verity paid out of the last of her mother's earrings, and asked no questions, because the village had its own long opinion of the great house and was glad of a chance to be on the other side of it. And on the night of the last day of February, while the household slept, and the deed lay ready on the writing table for the morning, Daniel Frost went into Lady Augusta's dressing room with a footman's silent feet, and opened the small writing cabinet she alone could open, and found folded in oilcloth beneath a stack of her son's school letters the deed of entail of Brindlemere Court, 200 years old, sealed and whole, naming the line of succession that ran through his own dead father's blood and forbidding, in the plain, hard Latin of a long-dead king's clerks, the conveyance of 1 acre of the estate away from the entailed heirs. He did not take it. That was the thing Verity had not expected, and the thing that told her at last exactly what manner of man she had fallen in love with. He did not take the deed and run, though it was his by right, and his father had perished for the want of it. He read it by the shielded light of a single candle, and he copied nothing, and he folded it back into its oilcloth and laid it beneath the school letters exactly as it had lain, and closed the cabinet, and locked it, and went out. A stolen deed proves nothing. A deed produced in private can be called a forgery. In turn, the truth the old man had sworn to with his last breath had to be read aloud in a room where it could not be ignored, and pulled by the rightful hand from the very cabinet of the woman who swore it did not exist. He had waited his whole life to be heard. He would not waste it on a theft in the dark. So they let the morning come, and the evening, and the candles lit 3 hours too early, and the soft round lawyer with his thickened papers, and Crispin lounging, and Lady Augusta serene, and the old Duke tired and willing, and the pen already wet in his hand. Verity stood against the bookshelves where a companion stands. Daniel stood at the wall in his blue livery, with his white gloves and his still face, furniture that walked, and the bead of ink gathered at the nib and wanted only to fall. "Do not sign." The old Duke lifted his head. In the silence that followed, every false thing in the room was suddenly visible, because a servant does not speak, and a servant had spoken, and the breaking of so deep a rule made the whole company look, for one beat, at what they were actually doing. Lady Augusta recovered first. She turned from the window and told the footman, in a voice gone to ice, to leave the room, and told the Duke smoothly that the man was plainly mad and would be turned off in the morning. Her hand made a small motion toward Crispin, who rose to put the servant out. And Daniel Frost stepped away from the wall and into the candlelight, and said in the level voice of a man who has decided to be heard at last, that he was not a footman, and that the deed his Grace held in his hand was a conveyance of property that his Grace had no lawful power to convey, because the estate of Brindlemere was bound by an entail 2 centuries old, and that the entail deed still existed whole and sealed, and that he could say precisely where it was, because he had held it in his hands 2 nights before, folded in oilcloth beneath a stack of school letters, in the locked writing cabinet in the dressing room of the lady who stood by the window and had spent a year swearing it was lost. The room did not move. Lady Augusta's smile did not so much fall as freeze, the calculation behind her eyes, running fast and finding for the first time in a year no road out. She said the man was a liar and a thief who had broken into her private rooms. And Daniel said, his voice never rising, that he had broken nothing and taken nothing, that the deed lay exactly where she had hidden it, untouched, and that there was one sure way to prove which of them lied, and it was to send a trusted hand for the cabinet and open it before them all. The Duke looked at his sister-in-law. He was old and he was tired, and his mind wandered by candlelight, but he had been a gentleman for 70 years, and some things a gentleman knows in his bones, after the rest has gone. He saw her face. He had been about to give away his father's house on the word of that face, and now he saw it stripped, and he knew. He sent his steward, Mr. Paget, who had served the house for 40 years, and loved it, with 2 of the Duke's own men, and Lady Augusta, who might have brazened it through, who might have refused and dared them to force the lock, made the single error that confident people make when their script fails for the first time. She moved. She started across the room toward the door, to reach the cabinet first, to be there when it was opened, and the movement was its own confession, and every soul in the library saw it. Crispin caught his mother's arm. Even he, who had lounged through a year of his own corruption, understood in that moment that the thing was lost, and that to be seen helping her now was to drown with her. And he let her go, and stepped back toward the fire, and looked at nothing. They brought the deed into the library, wrapped in its oilcloth, beneath the stack of school letters in her son's untidy hand, exactly as Daniel had described it before the cabinet was opened. And that was the proof that needed no court, because he had named the hiding place and the letters and the oilcloth in front of witnesses before the box was touched. The old Duke unfolded the 200 years of it on the table beside the false deed he had nearly signed, and read his father's blood named in it, and the long-quarreled cousin's branch named after, and the plain Latin forbidding exactly the gift he had been led to the edge of making. He set down the pen. He did not sign. What Lady Augusta said then, she said in pieces. The smooth poured cream voice was gone, and what came in its place was fragmented. A half-sentence about the boy's future, a half-sentence about a promise made to her dead husband, a half-sentence that began the entail, was never and did not end, because there was no end to it that the room would let her reach. She was not dragged out, and she was not struck, and no one gloated, because the house, awakened at last, had no need of cruelty. The Duke, with a weariness that was almost tender, told her that she would leave Brindlemere in the morning with her son, with her widow's portion untouched and not 1 penny more, and that he hoped for the sake of his brother's memory that she would learn somewhere else the thing she had never learned here. He did not name the thing. He did not need to. She heard it. And then the old Duke turned to the man who had stood at his wall all winter, in another man's livery, and asked him his name, his true name, and Daniel Frost gave it, and gave his father's. And the Duke was quiet for a long moment, because he remembered the quarrel 30 years gone, the misfiled papers. The cousin put out of the family over a claim that this very deed now proved had been just all along. The wall Lady Augusta had spent a year demolishing had been built to keep an honest man out, and it had kept his son out too, until his son came back as furniture and tore it down from the inside. There remained the matter of the companion, and it was the Duke who raised it, in the same hour, while the candles still burned. He turned to the gray-gowned girl by the bookshelves, whom his own household had named a thief on his sister-in-law's word, and he asked her, with the courtesy that had survived everything else in him, how a companion had come to find a line in a ledger that a duchess thought no one could read. And Verity told him plainly, without heat, and without claiming more than was hers, that her father had taught her to read accounts before he taught her anything else, and that the line had been there for anyone who troubled to look, and that no one ever troubles to look at what a companion can see. The Duke heard it, and in front of the same household that had passed the word thief from mouth to mouth, he said that he had wronged her, and that the wrong would be undone in the morning before all of them, and that she was no charity in his house, and never had been but the one clear pair of eyes in a winter of blind ones. It was not a grand speech. He was too tired and too old for grandeur. It was a plain old man saying he had been wrong, which is rarer than grandeur and worth more. And Verity, who had stood 11 weeks being spoken of in the third person, was spoken to at last as a person in front of the room that had decided she was not one. She married Daniel Frost in the spring, in the small gray church on the estate, with the bare limes coming into their first green outside the windows, and the old Duke watching from the family pew with the brightest eyes he had shown all year. The dukedom did not pass to Daniel, and neither of them had ever wanted it to. The entail named him heir to the cousin's branch, not to the title, and the title would die with the old man as titles do. What passed to Daniel was the thing his father had died for the want of, which was a name, cleared and a justice spoken aloud, and a place in the family that had cast his blood out. The Duke settled on him the cousin's portion that the old quarrel had stolen, restored and with interest, and made him steward in truth of the estate he had served in disguise, so that the house Lady Augusta would have hollowed out passed instead into the keeping of a man who had loved it enough to scrub its floors to save it. Lady Augusta Vane went north to a small house on a small income, and Crispin went with her, and the county talked of it for a season, and then, in the way of counties, found something else to talk of. There was no triumph in it for anyone at Brindlemere, and no one sought any. She had been a clever woman, whose cleverness had everywhere succeeded except here, in the one house where two people the world had counted as nobody had troubled to count her back. Verity, who might have hated her, found at the end that she only pitied her a little, the way one pities a strong swimmer who has misjudged the tide, and that pity was its own kind of victory, the kind that costs the victor nothing and the loser everything they cannot afford. The old Duke lived to see one more autumn. He spent it in the library, in good light now, with Verity reading to him in the long afternoons, and Daniel bringing the accounts to his chair so that the old man might see, while his eyes still held, that the house was safe and the books were honest, and the line he had nearly betrayed in a moment of tiredness ran clear into hands that would keep it. He died in his sleep in October, with his wife's name on his lips and no fear in his face, and he left the estate by a will so plainly drawn that no Mr. Golb, Quill in England, could have unpicked it, to the entailed heir, lawfully, in daylight, with his own clear hand. On the evening after they buried him, Verity went into the library alone and lit the candles at the proper hour, not 3 hours early, and set them where their light would fall clean across the green leather of the great table. The false deed was long gone, burned by the Duke's own hand the morning after the night. It was meant to be signed. The true deed lay in the iron box again where it belonged in the muniment room, sealed and whole, looked at now and then by people who at last knew how to read it. She stood at the table where a tired old man had once held a wet pen over the ruin of his house, and where a servant had said 3 words into the silence and stopped his hand. Daniel came and stood beside her in the candlelight, in a plain coat now and no livery, A man with his own name at last, and his father's name cleared. And he did not say anything because the room did not need it. He put his bare hand over hers on the green leather, the way he had once stood at a wall and could not, and she turned her hand under his so their palms met, and the candles burned down slow and even in the good, clean light, and the house that had nearly been given away in the dark held quiet around them and kept them, and was theirs to keep. If this story has stayed with you, sit a moment longer in that lit room before you go, and think of how often the one person in the corner, the one the whole house has decided is nobody, is the only one in it who is troubled to read what is written down. That is the whole of it. That is what the winter taught her. Thank you for staying to the end.